On a limestone cliff face in eastern Spain, roughly 8,000 years ago, someone painted a picture of the moment they nearly died for something sweet. The image shows a lone human figure clinging to a set of ropes or vines, scaling a sheer rock wall toward a dark crevice, surrounded by a swarm of furious dots swirling around their head. In one hand, they carry a basket. It is, as far as archaeologists can tell, the oldest picture ever made of a person stealing honey from a wild beehive, and whoever painted it wanted the danger remembered exactly as they lived it. Bees everywhere, a body dangling over open air, and no safety net of any kind. That painting still exists today in a cave called Cuevas de la Araña, and it raises an obvious question. Why would anyone risk a fall onto solid rock, surrounded by thousands of stinging insects, for a jar of something sweet? The answer is that for most of human history, honey was not a treat. It was the most concentrated dose of pure calories that existed anywhere in nature, and people were willing to bleed for it, worship it, tax it, and eventually, in the 21st century, commit organized international fraud over it on a scale of hundreds of millions of dollars. This is the story of how a substance made by insects became one of the most fought-over commodities in human history. Long before agriculture, before pottery, before most of the technologies we associate with early civilization, human foragers across Africa, Europe, and Asia were already going to extraordinary lengths to find wild bee colonies. In parts of Africa, this hunt for honey turned into one of the strangest cooperative relationships in the natural world. A small bird, known as the greater honey guide, learned that it could lead humans directly to wild hives, calling and flying in short hops toward the nest, waiting for the humans to break it open with fire and tools, and then feasting on the leftover wax and larvae once the humans had taken the honey for themselves. Communities that practice this partnership today, such as the Hadza people of Tanzania, can find hives many times faster with a honey guide's help than without one. It is one of the only documented cases of wild animals and humans actively communicating to cooperate on a hunt, and it likely stretches back tens of thousands of years, all because of how badly early humans wanted what was inside a beehive. That same willingness to risk everything for honey never actually disappeared, and in one corner of the world, it is still practiced today almost exactly the way that 8,000-year-old cave painting depicted it. In the mountains of Nepal, the Gurung people of the Lamjung district hunt honey from Apis laboriosa, the largest honeybee species on Earth, which builds its enormous combs on sheer exposed cliff faces thousands of feet above the valley floor. Before a hunt begins, the community performs a ceremony at the base of the cliff, offering rice, flowers, and incense to ask permission from the spirit believed to protect the mountain. Then a hunter climbs a handmade rope ladder woven from bamboo, called a prang, while smoke rises from a fire lit below to drive the enormous, aggressive bees away from the comb. Using a long pole called a tango, the hunter cuts free slabs of honeycomb that plunge to waiting collectors on the ground, all while dangling from a rope ladder over open air with nothing else holding him to the cliff. It is, quite literally, the same act depicted in that Mesolithic cave painting in Spain, performed by a living community in the 21st century, and it survives today for the same reason it always has. Some things are worth the risk. By the time organized civilizations emerged in the Nile Valley, honey had stopped being just a forager's prize and had become something close to a national obsession. Reliefs carved into the sun temple of the pharaoh Nusser, built around 2400 BCE, show Egyptian workers blowing smoke into hives, pulling out honeycomb, and pouring the harvest into storage vessels, the earliest known depiction of organized beekeeping anywhere on Earth. Egyptians used honey to sweeten food and drink, but they also relied on its antibacterial properties for medicine, applying it directly to wounds and burns in treatments recorded in medical papyri. And modern science has since confirmed that raw honey really does have genuine antimicrobial effects. Priests packed it into offerings for the gods. Morticians used it as part of the embalming process to help preserve the dead. And workers on major state projects were sometimes paid partly in honey, treating it as a form of currency, almost as reliable as grain. The bee itself became a symbol of the pharaoh's authority over Lower Egypt, appearing in royal titles carved beside the pharaoh's name. In a civilization obsessed with the afterlife and eternity, honey earned a strange kind of trust. Unlike almost every other food humans have ever produced, it does not spoil. Sealed honey found in millennia-old Egyptian tombs has, in modern times, still been perfectly edible. Egyptian beekeepers even understood something about geography that would not be formally studied again for thousands of years. They loaded hives onto rafts and floated them down the Nile, following the flowering season upriver, so their bees always had fresh blossoms to work. An early form of the same migratory beekeeping still practiced by truck-driving beekeepers today. The ancient Greeks took that reverence somewhere even more mythical. Greek poets described the food of the gods on Mount Olympus as nectar and ambrosia, and many classical scholars believe ambrosia itself was imagined as a form of honey, a substance so pure it was thought capable of granting immortality to anyone who ate enough of it. The philosopher Aristotle spent real time observing actual beehives and wrote detailed, surprisingly accurate descriptions of bee behavior and hive structure in his broader study of animals, centuries before anyone had a scientific framework for entomology at all. The Romans, meanwhile, treated honey as their primary sweetener in a world with no cane sugar, mixing it into wine to make a drink called mulsum that was served at the start of Roman banquets, and prescribing it constantly in the medical writings of the era for everything from sore throats to digestive trouble. For over 1,000 years across the Mediterranean world, if something needed to taste sweet, honey was almost always the only realistic option. And it was not only the Greeks and Romans who reached for honey as the ultimate symbol of abundance. In the Hebrew Bible, the land promised to the Israelites is described again and again as a land flowing with milk and honey, a phrase used specifically because, to people living in the ancient Near East, nothing signaled fertility and blessing quite like a landscape wealthy enough to be dripping with it. From Mount Olympus to the Promised Land to the temples of the Maya on the other side of an ocean, nobody in the ancient Mediterranean world even knew existed. Honey kept showing up in the exact same role across cultures that had no contact with each other whatsoever. Not just food, but the physical proof that a place, or a god, or an afterlife was good. Honey's reputation as medicine did not stay confined to Europe either. In the Quran, an entire chapter is named An-Nahl, the bee, and includes a verse describing a drink that comes from within the bee's body, of varying colors, containing healing for humankind, a line that scholars of Islamic medicine have cited for over 1,000 years to justify honey's central place in traditional treatment. Sayings attributed to the Prophet Muhammad go further still, describing honey and scripture together as the two cures available to humanity. Across the medieval Islamic world, physicians folded that religious authority directly into medical practice, prescribing honey for wounds, coughs, and digestive illness in texts that would go on to influence medicine across Europe for centuries. On the other side of the Atlantic, an entirely separate and independent tradition of sacred beekeeping was developing among the Maya. Long before Europeans arrived, Maya communities across the Yucatan Peninsula were keeping a small, stingless species of bee known in Yucatec Maya as Xunancab, the royal lady bee, housed in hollow wooden log hives that beekeepers there still use today. Maya religion built an entire god around this practice. Amuzincab, depicted upside down in Maya art and closely associated with the honey harvest, watched over ceremonies performed for the bees at temples along the coast, including sites near what is now the resort town of Tulum. Honey from these stingless hives was the only sweetener available anywhere in the pre-Columbian Americas. doubled as medicine for eye infections and digestive ailments, and functioned as a form of trade currency across Maya trading networks. An entire civilization on one side of the planet, independently arriving at the same conclusion Egypt had reached thousands of years earlier. Whoever controls the honey controls something close to wealth itself. Back in Europe, the fall of Rome did not slow honey's importance down even a little. If anything, a second, less obvious source of demand took over and pushed beekeeping even further into the center of medieval life. Candles. The Christian Church required enormous quantities of pure beeswax to light altars and chapels across Europe, since beeswax burned cleaner and more reliably than cheaper animal fat alternatives, and Catholic doctrine came to treat it as the only acceptable material for church candles. Monasteries across the continent kept extensive apiaries not primarily for the honey, but for the wax, and honey itself became something of a valuable byproduct of a religious wax industry. With cane sugar still an exotic, expensive import controlled by trade routes running through the Islamic world, honey remained the default sweetener for ordinary Europeans for close to 1,000 years after Rome fell, brewed into mead, baked into bread, and used to preserve fruit through the winter months in a world with no refrigeration of any kind. When European colonization reached the Americas in the 1600s, it brought something that had never existed anywhere in the Western Hemisphere before: the European honeybee itself. Records from the Virginia Company in London show that beehives were shipped out to the Jamestown colony around the winter of 1621, arriving with the following spring's supply ships in 1622, making European honeybees one of the earliest deliberate biological imports into English North America. A popular story claims that Native American communities, unfamiliar with this new insect, began calling it the white man's fly, treating its arrival and steady westward spread as an early warning sign of settlers not far behind. It is a wonderful story, and it has been repeated for centuries, but modern historians looking closely at the written record consider it largely a myth, likely invented decades later by colonial writers rather than genuinely documented at the time. What is verifiably true is simpler and still remarkable enough. Within a couple of centuries, an insect that had never set foot or wing on the continent had spread from a handful of imported hives in Virginia to nearly every corner of North America, entirely by hitching rides with colonial expansion. For most of that expansion, beekeeping itself had barely changed in thousands of years. Harvesting honey almost always meant destroying part or all of the hive to get at the comb inside, which was wasteful, unpredictable, and hard on the bees. That finally changed in 1851, when an American clergyman and amateur naturalist named Lorenzo Langstroth made an observation that seems almost too simple to matter. Bees consistently leave a gap of roughly 3/8 of an inch between combs and hive walls, a spacing scientists now call bee space. And if a hive is built to respect that exact gap, bees will not seal the structure shut with wax and propolis the way they seal every other surface. Langstroth used that discovery to design a hive with individual removable frames that beekeepers could lift out, inspect, and harvest without tearing the colony apart, and he patented the design in October of 1852. It is, with only minor refinements, still the standard hive used by beekeepers around the world today. And in a strange echo you will hear again and again in stories like this one, Langstroth barely profited from any of it. His patent was infringed constantly. Legal battles ate up years of his life and health, and the man now remembered as the father of American beekeeping never made real money off the single invention that built the entire modern honey industry. By the 20th century, honey had quietly become something even bigger than a food product, and most people who eat it have no idea. Bees pollinate roughly 1/3 of everything humans grow for food, and nowhere is that more obvious or more industrialized than in the almond orchards of California. Each winter, beekeepers from across the entire United States load more than 1.5 million honeybee colonies onto flatbed trucks, and haul them thousands of miles to California's Central Valley, where almond trees need intense, concentrated pollination over just a few weeks in order to produce a crop. Nearly 3/4 of all commercial honeybee colonies in the country converge on that single narrow window in a single state for a single crop. And the pollination service those bees provide is worth billions of dollars a year, often more valuable to the beekeepers renting out their hives than the honey those same bees will ever produce. Which is exactly why what happened starting in the fall of 2006 was so alarming. Commercial beekeepers began reporting something that had never been documented before: healthy, thriving colonies suddenly emptying out almost overnight. Worker bees simply vanishing without a trace of dead bodies anywhere nearby, leaving the queen and a handful of young bees behind with a hive full of untouched honey. Scientists named the mystery colony collapse disorder, and while the worst of it has since eased, honeybee losses in the years since have continued running at roughly 30% annually in the United States alone, a number that would be catastrophic in almost any other agricultural industry on Earth, and one that puts a real and growing share of the modern food supply at risk. Years of research since have made clear that there was never a single villain behind the disappearances. Parasitic Varroa mites, which spread a debilitating deformed wing virus through colonies, are now considered the leading factor in ongoing losses. But researchers have found that mites interact with something else in a genuinely dangerous way. A class of pesticides called neonicotinoids, widely used in industrial agriculture, appears to weaken bees' immune systems and impair their navigation and learning just enough that infections the colony could normally fight off instead become fatal. It is not one cause. It is several problems compounding each other inside the same fragile hive, and no single fix has been enough to make the losses stop. And then there is the part of honey's modern story that sounds less like agriculture and more like organized crime. Because pure honey is expensive and slow to produce, and because it is remarkably easy to stretch with cheap sugar syrup or mislabel about where it actually came from, honey has become one of the most commonly faked foods sold anywhere in the world. The most dramatic example played out in the United States starting in the mid-2000s, after the government imposed steep tariffs on honey imported directly from China to protect domestic beekeepers from being undercut. Rather than pay those tariffs, some Chinese exporters began routing honey through other countries first, relabeling the paperwork to claim it had originated in places like India, Indonesia, Malaysia, or Thailand, in a scheme investigators eventually nicknamed honey laundering. When American authorities finally cracked the scheme in an operation that came to be known as Honeygate, they charged 2 major U.S. honey packing companies and several individuals with evading roughly $180 million in tariffs, and one Texas-based broker was later sentenced to 3 years in federal prison specifically for his role in the fraud. Investigators also found that some of the smuggled honey contained unauthorized antibiotics banned from the American food supply, meaning the fraud was not just about money. It was a genuine public health risk hidden inside a jar that looked exactly like every other bottle of honey on a grocery store shelf. Independent lab testing conducted around the same period suggested that a significant share of honey sold in ordinary American supermarkets had been cut with cheap syrup or mislabeled about its true origin, meaning a real portion of what most people picture as pure, simple honey may never have come from a healthy hive at all. All of that history sits underneath an industry that, on paper, looks almost boringly stable. The world now produces around 2 million tons of honey a year, worth roughly $6.5 billion, spread across beekeepers on every continent except Antarctica. China alone accounts for close to a quarter of that total, producing nearly 4 times as much honey as the second largest producer, Turkey, with Iran and India rounding out a global top 5 that spans 3 different continents. But raw tonnage hides an enormous gap in value. Honey from major low-cost producers like China sells for a fraction of the price per ton that honey from countries like Germany commands, a gap wide enough that it is, in large part, exactly what made cutting corners on the supply chain so tempting in the first place. Which makes the flip side of the modern honey story feel almost like a correction. In New Zealand, a variety of honey made from bees that feed on the native manuka bush has become one of the most expensive honey products in the world, sometimes selling for well over $100 for a single small jar, because independent lab testing can verify a natural compound in the honey with genuine, measurable antibacterial strength, strong enough that some hospitals use medical-grade versions of it in wound care. It is, in a strange way, the 21st century's answer to the antibacterial wound dressings Egyptian doctors were already improvising with honey more than 4,000 years earlier. The same basic property, rediscovered, verified in a modern laboratory, and sold back to the world at a spectacular markup. The scientist most responsible for that rediscovery was Peter Molen, a biologist at the University of Waikato in New Zealand, who began investigating honey's antiseptic properties in 1981. Within a few years, Molen identified something unusual in manuka honey specifically. Even after neutralizing the ordinary hydrogen peroxide-based antibacterial effect found in most honey, manuka honey retained a separate, much stronger antibacterial activity that nothing else could explain. He spent the following decade studying the compound responsible, eventually helping develop a rating system called the Unique Manuka Factor, or UMF, that today lets hospitals and consumers verify exactly how potent a given jar actually is. A discovery that started with one professor testing honey samples in a university lab turned into a global export industry worth hundreds of millions of dollars a year, all resting on a chemical property that Egyptian embalmers had been exploiting by instinct for over 4,000 years without ever knowing why it worked. From a cave painting of someone risking a fall to their death for a wild honeycomb, to a symbol carved beside a pharaoh's name, to the only sweetener available to two entire civilizations that never knew the other existed, to a religious wax industry that quietly kept European beekeeping alive for 1,000 years, to a preacher's simple observation about a 3/8-inch gap that built the modern hive, to a truck convoy hauling over 1 million colonies across America every winter, to a $180 million international smuggling case. Honey has never really been just a food. It is one of the very few things humans have wanted badly enough in every era and on every continent to build entire systems of religion, medicine, economics, and eventually crime around a substance that a colony of insects makes, essentially by accident. The next time you see a small, bear-shaped bottle of it sitting in your kitchen cabinet, it is worth remembering that someone, somewhere, once painted the moment they nearly died just to get their hands on it. If this one surprised you, hit subscribe and drop a comment telling us which part of honey's history you didn't see coming. New episodes on the hidden histories behind everyday foodland every week, and you will not want to miss the next one.